Hello, my name is Bendistis, and this is a short video lecture on creating an open memo, aka, damn it, Jim, I'm a paralegal, not a time traveler. Now, when it comes to writing open memos, there's a lot of different little things that I think are important to note as you're putting your part together. Okay, I'm going to speak kind of generally about memos, and I think they're going to sort of incorporate concepts that we have covered previously in IRACing and just making sure you're focusing on them just the same. The big thing when it comes to memos is, one, this is not a research project and this is not a book report. So when you're putting together your open memo, you are not just describing a collection of cases over and over again, but it is a collection of IRACs. So every IRAC has to sort of be addressing the issues that are important, right? The key thing I want to note why we're talking about Star Trek references is the tone of your memo, right? I think that one of the big focuses with legal writing classes, and this is just for legal writing, this isn't for other things, but that the number one thing you're being tested on here is structure and form. That's it, right? There is a propensity, I think, to want to be right, to make sure that your answer is correct and protect this hypothetical client that doesn't actually exist. But the key thing with all of the law is that you are not a time traveler, because the best thing that any lawyer would be able to have would be a time machine. That would be the best thing that I could have, because I could say things like, you shouldn't sell drugs, or you shouldn't lend your brother-in-law your life savings, or maybe that mortgage isn't the best idea to get right now or to give to somebody. So when you're putting this together, you're being objective. You're just including the law. You don't have to convince me of anything. You don't have to worry about anything. The one thing I will say is if you're having trouble finding a conclusion, okay, one, you don't have to come to an answer, because this isn't a job where you have to save somebody. Instead, either present both sides of the issue. If the answer is maybe, tell me why it's maybe. Right? Give me both sides and make a guess. Otherwise, one of the best things for these hypothetical assignments is just pick a side and go with it, right? I have taught legal writing for a very long time, and what I have found is the person who commonly would get the highest grade in my writing classes would have the wrong conclusion, right? I mean, how would that even work? But if they're structured the right way and everything's put together, it doesn't really matter, because commonly your writing courses aren't civil courses, they're not wills and trusts, they're not criminal law. So focus on the elements we're covering here. Worry about being right and saving people much later. All right. Key elements that are part of your memo. First is the question presented, right? This is the same issue spotting practice that we've covered in other lectures, okay? So you want to make sure that you're including facts and law, okay? If you've got multiple issues within your memo, make sure that you have an issue presented for each thing. You don't try to cover everything in one big section, because your issue should really stand alone and your section should stand alone. If you're trying to develop different areas of law, it will commonly look like a total mess. Brief answer must mirror the question presented. So in form and content, you should be answering the question and including sort of a law and fact section, right? Seems very easy. Fact section. Okay? The fact section, I think, seems incredibly simple. And it's one of those things where you go, oh, I'll just do it at the very beginning or I'll do it at the very end. Always make sure that regardless of how you write the fact section, you've amended it at the very end. This is the part of legal writing I hate the most. I hate writing fact sections, because after getting into such levels of depth with the discussion, the facts always seem so tedious. So what I will commonly do is write a skeleton and then add it in a little bit later. Okay, a few rules that I want to cover here is, one, legally operative facts, only thing that is known with certainty. You have the entire paper to make legal arguments. If you want to be subtle with your arguments and how you present the facts, go crazy. But it has to be subtle. If you're being persuasive or argumentative in the fact section, you sort of lose your audience a little bit. So just include what is known with certainty. I would rather your paper sound robotic than sound like Henry James Thoreau. So you don't need to be overly thorough with your story or tell a narrative. It's just every sentence, boom, 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 and that's it. No opinions by you or the parties in the case. Again, you have the entire paper to write your conclusion. Just tell me what happened with very particular things, right? Be concise. Write everything in your own words. There's a key point with the facts of you should be organizing the facts in your own type of section, right? I often think that a key way to do it is by using paragraphs judiciously. Use your first paragraph to tell me who everyone is, then tell me the first story, then the second story, and then why we're actually here and why we're suing somebody. If you have it organized in a way where you've got even like 3-sentence or 2-sentence paragraphs, it's easy for a person to read and understand where everything is, and it keeps you from being repetitive. This should not be a big section. It should actually be very easy to read and be simple. A long fact section is probably not usually a good fact section, so try to be concise and write everything in your own words. You must include all facts that are referenced in your brief. The key thing on the other end is you shouldn't be including things that aren't referenced. So that's one of the reasons 5. Amend everything at the very end, making sure that you're only things that are absolutely necessary. This kind of goes into another way that you can organize your brief, which is I usually do the fact section by persons, right? So if you got a lot of people, it's who's the plaintiff, who's the defendant, who's this person, and then kind of tell the story through there. I think that can be a really effective way to kind of make sure that you're presenting everybody in a way that makes a lot of sense. A few little nuances here. One is called a thesis paragraph, which is a way to start your memo. If you've got a problem that's got multiple elements, a long IRAC that covers, a whole bunch of things is often unwieldy, right? So I often think if you've got more than 2 elements of something, commonly a good way to structure your memo is to start with a thesis paragraph and then do subsequent IRACs underneath that deal with the elements, right? This will be something that would introduce the issue broadly. What's the overall problem? Give the broadest rule applicable. Apply the facts that justify your conclusion and restate your conclusion. The start of your memo should tell me what the answer is, right? And that's another thing where you only know after you've gone back. So it's commonly you're writing things a little bit in chunks. But one of the big things with legal writing is we're not saving it till the end. This isn't M. Night Shyamalan writing. This is telling us in the very beginning, and we're not saving the surprises. By the time I've gotten to the end, I should be convinced of the conclusion you've told me multiple times. And this is an easy way to kind of reinforce it. The other nice thing about the thesis paragraph is it sets the stage for the later writing. So if you're finding that your paper is too unruly, think about ways to cut it into separate paragraphs and separate sections, and you're going to find that it always reads better. That's something that I always do, and it's always helped my writing to make sure that everything's going to be helpful from there. Rule statements, we talked about this a little bit in previous lectures, but just kind of reinforcing it, where your rules section should be the first thing that you write. That's the meat and potatoes of everything, and everything else comes afterward. You have the broad statement of law, practical ways to prove the law, and examples of the law in practice. If you don't have the first 2 and you've only got the third, you've got a problem. So make sure that you're highlighting a narrative flow of everything that starts with the broad sections, goes practical, and if you've got to use case law, fine, but please, I'm begging you, don't use more than 1 sentence on any case, and don't tell me how that other case was resolved, because if I need to know it, if I need to know the plaintiff won, or the defendant won, or why they won, I'll read the case, right? So only use the case if you're using it to prove a point. For example, if the standard for, let's say, proving attempt considers a high burden the state must prove, you'd use a case to say the state was unable to prove even though all these things were there, showing how high it is. But you don't need to prove what happened, why they did it, what was the corresponding factors. It doesn't need to be that in depth. So make sure you don't waste time and energy doing there. Finally, application. This is the same thing we had mentioned before. Do not restate facts or law without a conclusion or an analysis. So if you're stating something and it's just a sentence telling the story, remember that the fact section has told the story. You can assume that someone who's reading your memo knows what happened, right? Know your audience, okay? Always add because, use sentences making sure you're explaining everything, and present both sides of the argument. If you're running out of room, talk about both elements of it, because you might find that both sides give a better picture of everything. I often like to start the other side's argument by saying, the other side may argue blank, but, and then I say why it's wrong. It's a really effective way to address the elephant in the room, which is an important thing to cover. Finally, don't be afraid to call on your common sense or your experience. If you're analyzing something and you look at a problem and you go, that's gotta be wrong, you can still sort of be analytical. You can be creative, right? The creativeness comes within the arguments. I have often found that I like to think I'm a creative person, and it's not that I'm creatively writing the law. My law is very dry. It's very point blank. I want to make sure that anyone who reads something knows where it is. But when I'm analyzing it and putting arguments together, that's where you can sort of really shine. And I think that's a really good approach of how you're putting things, because that's really where you're going to get your value, right? So noting the fact that you are not a time traveler, you are not a historian, you are not telling a story, you're not Stephen King. You are someone who is giving your conclusion early and often. You're being clear and concise, and you are also not worrying about how great it sounds, you're worrying about how clear it is and how informative your writing is, okay? Thank you very much for listening. If you have any other interest in these YouTube videos, please check out my other videos. Otherwise, look at my podcast. It's The Citizen's Guide to the Supreme Court on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. Otherwise, I hope you guys learned something, and I'll see you guys later.